Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Late Thursday night, Mario Cristobal, the Miami Hurricanes, they went out and just made a massive splash, going out and poaching the Florida Gators defensive backs coach Will Harris, bringing him over to Miami. Now, we reacted to that late Thursday night. A lot of Miami Hurricane fans know this already. I was a massive fan of this move just from a pure player development standpoint. You look at Will Harris, not only what he did with Florida, where he completely turned around that secondary and really had that Florida Gator secondary towards the back half of 2024 playing exceptional football, but you look at the track record as a whole in terms of player development. What he did at Washington, just putting out a ton of guys into the NFL draft. I mean, that the Washington Huskies under Will Harris, it was a factory for NFL defensive backs. So from a player development standpoint, it's really hard to nitpick this hire. What he brings on the recruiting trail is something we didn't really talk about, but when you start to dive into it, I mean, Will Harris brings a ton of juice on the recruiting trail, and it's probably only going to get better because you look at Will Harris and his background. I mean, he was born and raised in California, played his football at USC, spent a lot of time out there on the West Coast. He's just kind of digging his teeth in to the state of Florida on the recruiting trail and did a very good job in a short amount of time with the Florida Gators. And Miami Hurricane fans, y'all know this firsthand. And there were a couple of really good players that Miami threw everything at that ended up going to Florida. And so not only are you getting a really, really good defensive backs coach that's coming into a room that has a ton of just raw talent. I mean, you talk about Xavier Lucas. You talk about a guy like Emmanuel Carnley, who might be the most talented defensive back in that room, Zaquan Patterson, OJ Frederic. I, I'm probably forgetting a few, Charles Brantley, Ethan O'Connor. It's it's a really talented room that now you're putting a really good defensive backs coach in. You love that. But what he brings on the recruiting trail, I think, is going to be a really interesting conversation to see how it plays out over the next couple of weeks and months as well. And I want to dive into what the impact Will Harris might have on the recruiting trail for this Miami program as well. Before we get into it, as always, the Miami Hurricane fans, y'all were certainly letting it fly Thursday night. Would love to hear how we're feeling about it 48 hours removed. The amount of support y'all continue to show means the absolute world. It's going to be really fun to talk about this team on the recruiting trail over the next couple of months. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it now. The first thing that stands out to me when I'm starting to map out this episode is, look, Will Harris did not come to Florida with ties in state and all these relationships with high school coaches. It was largely, hey, I'm a really good defensive backs coach that can sell player development to these kids on the high school recruiting trail. 12 months into his job at Florida, you really saw him blossom in terms of what he could do in the state of Florida on the recruiting trail. The conversation has to start at a couple different spots. Let's start it going back to 2025 and talk about some of the guys that Will Harris played a massive role in getting to Florida that Miami was really in on too. And I'm not trying to get up here and say that Miami's going to land all of these guys in the spring transfer portal window, but I'm also not saying that, because Will Harris developed a lot of really strong relationships with guys that Miami and Florida were going after, both hard on the recruiting trail that ended up going to Florida. Could the presence of Will Harris coming to Miami maybe bring one of these players along? That's certainly worth discussing right off the bat. Let's start with Dallas Wilson, right? Dallas Wilson plays wide receiver, but Will Harris was one of the guys that was recruiting Dallas Wilson the most to this Florida program. Dallas Wilson obviously was a top Miami target pretty much throughout this process. Late in the process, essentially flipped from Oregon, committed to Florida, is now enrolled there. Again, this is not me getting up here and saying that Dallas Wilson's coming to Miami, but it's probably worth mentioning, especially as we talk about Miami saying, hey, do we have enough wide receiver talent around Carson Beck going into 2025? Because I look at a guy like Dallas Wilson and say, if he were to come to Miami, he would play a role day one as a true freshman in terms of what this Miami Hurricanes offense looks like. The next name you probably want to talk about, hometown kid Ben Hanks. And again, Ben Hanks' familial relationships to Florida probably was a driving factor in him going to Gainesville. This was also a guy that Will Harris was the primary recruiter on. He's a Miami, Florida guy, went to Booker T. Washington. again, are we getting up here and saying Ben Hanks is just going to follow Will Harris to Miami? No. But whether it's in this spring transfer portal window, whether it's in the next one after his freshman year, this would certainly be one to keep your eyes on. And then the last one, and I think the most intriguing one, and really just one of my favorite prospects in that 2025 class, Hill and Drake Stubbs. I mean, I think he is going to be a stud at safety, really wherever he plays his college football. Right now, currently at Florida. He was previously committed to Miami. Will Harris was the primary recruiter that got him to Gainesville. And you got three guys in this Florida class in 2025 that were top Miami Hurricane targets that ended up going elsewhere to Florida. Will Harris played a significant role in all three of those players going to the Florida Gators. At the very least, it just shows the recruiting chops that Will Harris had, because there were times in that 2024 season where Florida was faltering and Miami was going in the right direction, and Will Harris was still able to bring some of these elite guys to Gainesville, Florida. That's probably where it starts. Is hey, he just this is an example of what Will Harris can do on the recruiting trail. And then number two, hey, somewhere down the line, will you have a chance to add one of these three, of which I think are elite talents? Do you have the opportunity to bring them to Miami? We'll kind of see how it plays out. Now, I think the more intriguing conversation here is, all right, what does it look like in the 2026 class? You know where we're going to start. Jalen Waters. I mean, to me, and I ain't no insider. I say that all the time. I'm looking at the tea leaves here. Miami was already in a good position to flip Jalen Waters before Will Harris came over. Now the guy that brought that essentially landed the commitment of Jalen Waters to Florida is now coaching for Miami. I look at this and say, you have to favor Miami to end up signing a guy like Jalen Waters in this 2026 class. And there's a lot to like about what Jalen Waters brings. 6'2", buck 75, really smooth athlete that can play press man coverage, that can play the football in the air. It's hard to find these defensive backs that have that size and movement skill combination. Jalen Waters to me has that. Just an early, from what I saw in the junior film of Jalen Waters, he's probably a guy that finishes as a top 150, maybe even top 100 prospect in this 2026 cycle. Another name that I would certainly be keeping an eye on is Caden Hall, guy that Will Harris was recruiting to Florida. That's between Miami and Florida, Milton, Florida kid. This is another one. And Caden Hall is an intriguing one. Plays safety. I almost think he could play linebacker at the next level. And you've seen Miami like to do this, right? I think Bobby Pruitt's probably the best example with, hey, we get big body safeties that are really good athletes that we think we can get up to 230 pounds. We want to play them at off-ball linebacker, because one of the things we've talked about extensively with Miami and what they're trying to do going forward is, hey, we got to get more athletic at the linebacker spot. And we talk about it all the time. It's just this is where the sport is going. Speed and space. You need linebackers that can operate in man coverage, that can go sideline to sideline and cover a lot of ground. And you look at a guy like Maui Noah, that in the 2025 year, it was very clear Miami did not have good enough athletes at the linebacker spot. And that's something I'm really excited for going into 2025, where you look at a Darius Hayes or a Bobby Pruitt. I mean, yeah, they're smaller linebackers, but they're much more athletic and can operate in space more. And you saw a lot of offenses really attack the athleticism of the Miami Hurricane linebackers last year. Miami's trying to get more athletic at this position. And Caden Hall very well might just settle in at safety, but he comes up and tackles like madman. And a guy that I certainly, with that 6'3" frame, could see getting up to 220 pounds and playing off-ball linebacker. But Will Harris could be a factor here in this recruitment. Last one I'll talk about, Aiden Pouncey, who's got some real ties to Florida. Will Harris was recruiting him to Florida. Probably puts Miami in a good spot for a guy like Aiden Pouncey as well. And these are only the names that kind of Miami and Florida have been early going at it on the recruiting trail in 2026. That's not to mention that just Will Harris has shown that he's a very good recruiter, especially in the state of Florida. And so you start looking at these recruiting battles that we often see come down to Miami and Florida. Will Harris, not only a very good coach that I think can develop talent, also can play a role in winning some of these recruiting battles. And we say this all the time. These kind of battles between teams like Miami and Florida, they're massive. The casual college football fan might not want to talk about it when we're sitting here in May talking about these recruiting battles and breaking down commitments. These are the commitments that can allow you to take the next step as a program. And I think Will Harris brings a ton of juice to what Miami can do on the recruiting trail. We'll sum it up like this, and y'all have heard me say this. We look at two things when we're evaluating position coach hires. Can you recruit really well? Can you bring top talent into your program? And can you develop that top talent? If you get a coach that can do both, chances are it's a good hire. And Will Harris has certainly shown that he's a very good player developer, but he's also shown that he can recruit the heck out of the state of Florida. And it probably only gets better as Will Harris spends more time in the state. There's a lot of reasons to like this one, especially just if you're a Miami Hurricane fan, taking what I think was one of the better position coaches away from Florida. But the impact it can have on the recruiting trail is something that I think we should be talking about, keeping an eye out on over the next couple of weeks and months. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Again, we'll getting kind of kicking it into gear with this 2026 class. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.